Welcome to Rising Tide Startups, where today's most exciting startup founders share their stories and strategies. They also deliver tangible lessons learned along the way that you can apply to your own startup. Each episode is a true masterclass. Make sure you take notes. Take it away, Kevin.
A lot too, if you want. This is Kevin Pruitt with another episode of Rising Tide Startups, and I have a special guest on with me today, Jerome DeRoy. Jerome, thanks for joining us on Rising Tide.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me.
So it would be really easy for me to say, hey, just tell us about yourself. But I would like to be a little more refined in how a little specific and on how we talk about this. It's like, how would you introduce yourself in English if we met at a networking event?
Yes. Well, yes, I was born in France, so I could also do it in French. But I've been in the US for a long time now. It's almost it's more than 20 years, or coming up on 20 years. And so the way I'd introduce myself, I'm in the storytelling field. So there is a story that I have about, what kind of brought me here and how I came to do what I'm doing, because when I say to people that I'm running a company that specializes in teaching storytelling in business, it's a bit of a head scratcher sometimes, and there's no degree for that.
Yeah.
So I went to business school, and I grew up in France, and so I that's where I went to business school, and then I started a job in banking, worked in finance for almost 5 years, which took me to Paris and then to Hong Kong in Asia. And somewhere along the way, about four years into this job, I was a marketing manager and for like an asset management company. And one day I looked on my computer, I put in 3 words or 3 terms in my search engine. One of them was business, the other one was film, and the other one was New York. And then I looked at the results. And 6 months after that, I walked into my boss's office and I told him, Lawrence, I quit. And he said to me, well, what are you going to do? Oh, no, don't tell me. I know you're going to go and work for another bank because they pay more. I'm really sorry. My hands are tied. I said, no, that's not what I'm going to do. He said, oh, I know what you're going to do. You're going to go and do what a lot of other people have done, is they go and work for a big consulting firm like McKinsey. That's what you're going to do. I said, no, that's not what I'm going to do. He said, well, what are you going to do? I don't get it. And I said, well, I'm not sure, but I know it's going to be creative and meaningful. And then I found myself in New York, and I was visiting my sister, staying with my sister who lived in New York. And I met the founder of Narativ, this company that I now run.
Wow.
And that was back in 2005. And it took another couple of years for us to actually work together, but he told me all about this methodology of storytelling and how he really felt businesses could use that. And that because of my business background, maybe I could help him figure out how to do that. And so that's what I did. And then a bit later, we had our first client in 2007. And I haven't looked back since. So that's my story.
So the entry point into Narativ was marketing manager, sales. Where did you enter? Because I'm assuming you didn't enter CEO.
No, I didn't. And actually, I so it's even more of a kind of natural or circuitous way, I should say, to get to this job, is that I met the founder of Narativ. His name is Nossel, because at the time he was making documentary films, and I was interested in the world of film. I wanted to be on the business side of film, hence those terms that I put in my search engine, and that's how I met him. And he was looking for an intern to help him, not at all on this business, but to help him on one of his films that had been bought by HBO and the BBC. And he wanted to reach, more people essentially. And so he was looking for someone who had that marketing background, which I did. And so, but I was an intern. And then about 3 months in, there was a budget for my position, and we called it production management. So that's what I ended up doing. I started managing his projects. And along the way, he told me about this company that he had created but wasn't doing much with. People would come to him, mostly nonprofit organizations that had like a message that was very urgent,
right,
and needed a story. And because of his background as a psychologist, anthropologist, social worker, and filmmaker, he had created this methodology, and essentially would deliver it to people who asked, but wasn't doing any kind of marketing around it. And one day he said, I really think we should try, and maybe because of your background, you could help me market this. And so I started doing that kind of as a side gig, really, because my main job was to be a production manager. And about a year in, we once we got our first client and we could see a little bit of runway, we both decided we would do this full time. And then a few years later was when I started to really run the business and essentially gave myself the title of CEO.
So tell me, to me, I would think that there's a fairly steep learning curve that or story curve you got to take people through to get them to kind of understand the value. I mean, it's easy to say, you need to tell your story and it will help you, increase sales or whatever, whatever the end result is. But I think the difficulty is like putting a value on that.
Yeah.
Like do they ask you, well, what's the ROI? What, is there, is that a hurdle or an obstacle you got to overcome?
It definitely was at first, especially when we didn't have much of a track record. We had to sort of point to other experiences that were not a one for one. So for instance, when we were pitching to a large corporation and their sales department, we would have to go back to experiences that we had in the advocacy world to say, well, we managed to raise so many dollars for this particular cause. But and in my mind, it makes sense that, that's very similar to sales. You need a message and you need to be consistent with your message and you need a great story to bring it to life. But in the mind of someone who's thinking about their business and exactly that ROI, it's more difficult to make that leap. And so, but that's what we did anyway, because that's what we had. So we started with that. But then what we realized is that what people were really asking us about is they were asking us about engagement, and they would sort of say what their pain points were and challenges were. And so very often it was like, we've got this great message and we're positioned well, we figured out who our audience is, but somehow these messages are not landing with our audience and we need something to make it stick. But it would take something on our end to listen and to ask the right questions to get to that answer. And once we got to that answer of like, it's not sticking, and as a result, we're not making as much as we could in terms of results, then we knew that we had something, because we could actually say, well, look, the story is what makes the difference, because that's what people are going to remember about you, your service, your product. And then that's when they got the value, and of course, when they saw it in action, because as you said, there is a steep learning curve in terms of, first you have to find the value, and then, they kind of believed us. And then we actually did the work. And there is a steep learning curve in terms of how to tell a story and, learning that. But it actually doesn't take that long. I often see that after a day of working with people, at the end of that day, they have a story, and they have a story that's, pretty tight. And most importantly, even if it's not like the most beautiful story I've ever heard, it's a story that's very authentic to who they are. So in other words, it's my story of this service, of this company. It's not the CEO's story that I'm repeating. It's like real. It's something that happened to me and that I can relate to. And as a result, if I'm able to tell a story that I can relate to, chances are you're going to relate to it, because I'm more passionate about it, because now I believe in what I'm saying, because I've got a story about it.
Is there a standard kind of template that you're walking people through that, kind of, it's almost like the story arc, or the hero's journey, or whatever you want to, whatever other, I guess, resource you want to kind of bring to bear here. But I mean, or are there different pathways for different purposes? Like,
there's definitely
history, we want to tell why this is important, that type of thing. So.
Well, there's definitely a method, and it is something that we repeat. So no matter who the audience is, actually, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit or sales or internal, employee engagement, that kind of thing. And it's very consistent. And the reason that it's so consistent and doesn't vary much is because we really believe that everyone can learn to tell their story. And a lot of times the obstacle that we have to overcome is sort of this lack of self-belief that I can tell a story.
Yep.
And usually a lot of people will think, well, that person's better at it, so I'm just going to let them do it. But the truth is that, the more you can get in touch with your own story and be able to tell it, the more you're going to be engaging to whatever audience. And you never know when you're going to have to say something about the company that you work for,
right?
And what might be an opportunity to actually sell your services. You're at a dinner party and someone asks you what you do, there's an opportunity there. And so, that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is, in terms of that method, what's interesting is that when my business partner, Murray, created that method, he did it because there was nothing else available, really.
Mm-hmm.
And he was working at the time with people who were literally either dying or had been given a diagnosis that meant that they were very likely to die. And this was in the mid-1990s, and it was the AIDS epidemic.
Mm.
And specifically, he was doing a PhD in social work, and he was placed in a program to help people as a social worker deal with the fact that, they were probably going to die very soon. And you could see it, you could see it in the streets of New York at the time, and there were no treatments that exist like the ones that exist today. And so it was a real crisis. And the reason that they started to look at storytelling in this program is because nothing else was working. When he was using his kind of training as a psychologist and as a social worker, he would be one-on-one with people, and he would say, "How do you feel?" And I said, "Well, how does that help me to tell you how I feel? How would you feel if you knew you were going to die in a week? What kind of dumb question is that? What are they teaching you?" And so then he said, well, once he heard from one of the people in the program that what they were afraid of was not of dying, that they had all kind of come to terms with that, and that actually they had sort of found a community within this program because they all had the same diagnosis, but also many of them had the same background and felt very, very marginalized and were very marginalized. And here they all had this great sense of belonging. But what she said they were afraid of was that they were afraid of leaving nothing behind, that they wouldn't be remembered.
No legacy, no heritage.
Nothing. And so that's when he had the idea, well, why don't you tell me the story, and not just to me one-on-one, but as a group. And then those of us who are alive will carry those memories forward. And yet, when he, even as appealing as that may sound because of that pain point, right? I'm not going to be remembered. Well, tell your story. There was still that hurdle that I also hear in businesses. It's like, but how? My story's not interesting. I've been a crack addict. What do I say? I said, no, that's your story. So the first thing he had to do, and this is part of our method, is really look at listening and what gets in the way of people's ability to listen to one another and to really be present. And so they started with that. They just started with working with listening through different kinds of, what we would call today, but at the time, no, it was mindfulness and meditative practices and things like that. And then once people got really present and they got a sense of safety, that they were in a space where it was possible to listen to each other, stories started to emerge and people started to open up. And then when one person told their story, the 5 other people who didn't want to, suddenly they wanted to, because they could find a connection with that story. And little by little, everyone told their story, and then they made videotapes of their stories. Wow. And when the government threatened financial cutbacks on programs like theirs, they left their tapes on the desks of legislators and told them, listen to my story, watch my story, and tell me I don't deserve the same right as everybody else. But it's that methodology that was so effective that we still use today. I adapted it quite a bit for businesses. So, it's that methodology that really helped people to feel comfortable and safe and be able to really open up. And that method is the one that we use in businesses. It really hasn't changed that much. And the main thing is that it starts with listening. And when you start with that, you're taking the pressure off of, oh, I have to be a storyteller, I have to
Right.
perform,
Right.
it's all on me. Because what we say is actually it's all on the listener,
Mm.
because the listener is the one that's giving you something that you can actually, that allows you to speak, essentially. And we've kind of all been in those situations where, your listeners, either they allow you to speak or they don't. And a lot of times they don't, they're just waiting for them to speak. So we sort of look at that first, and then we have, some specific points that sort of show how to tell an effective story. And the main one I will give you now is to really follow what happened, so that every story should be the answer to the question, what happened? Sounds pretty obvious. And, like every journalist will probably say, well, yeah, of course, what happened? But it's not easy when you put it in practice, because what people tend to do is they tend to tell you what they thought about what happened, what they felt about what happened, what their opinions were about what happened, what their interpretations were about what happened, so much so that you don't even know what happened. so
I'm having to extrapolate here out of the details you left out.
Exactly. And the idea with human beings is that, we respond to stories because our brains are wired for them. And so we can fill in the blanks. When we hear a story, we naturally know how to respond to the arc. We want to find out what the turning point is, what the resolution is, what's the challenge at the beginning. We know all these things naturally. We don't have to learn these things.
Right.
And so what you really do have to learn is kind of parsing out what's really truly something that happened in an experience that's in the real world, as opposed to what's going on in your head, which, since I'm not in your head, I can either agree with it or disagree with it, right, but I can't disagree with the facts of an experience that actually happened.
It was interesting. I talked about the story. I didn't tell you what happened in the story, but as you were talking, I was almost imagining these two different scenarios. So one is like, we're going to teach you how to tell the story of your business, or tell the story of the product. The second, maybe completely unrelated, is how to relate communication to story in general. Yeah. So like when you're engaging a client, how do you like create a story on the fly? How do you create set the stage where we're just not, talking at each other, but I'm kind of setting a scene. I'm really painting a picture, mentally in your mind. So are both of those kind of true, or do you kind of lean one way or the other as far as just the company itself is concerned? Does that make sense at all?
It does. And I definitely lean towards the latter. In other words, the one where you're able to, create that story out of the person who's listening to you, out of their listening. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily on the fly, but because it could be, we sort of have these stories that we teach how to tell, which we kind of call them the back pocket story, or the hip pocket story. Right. And you always have a story that's ready to go, but you may or may not tell it depending on your audience. But the point is that you always have one that's ready. And it relates to you, as opposed to the story of the company or the product that's been sort of created by your marketing department. And those, for me, the word itself, story, has a very particular meaning. And to me, it's always related to something personal. So that's kind of why we even say that what we do is personal storytelling for business, because it's always the personal stories that guide us in many of our decisions, even in our entertainment. I mean, that's what it's what engages us. And then I think that from those personal stories, you can create the story of the company. When it's done the other way around, it's a little more difficult to create that authenticity, right, and that sense of connection. I see that. It becomes a little bit more abstract, and more difficult for someone to relate to that story. So very often we get to that kind of general messaging of the company through the stories that we hear from individuals in a particular department. And we'll be very strategic about that. We'll find the right people so that there's a diversity and a representation there. And also we'll do it according to certain themes or values that we know the company and these products are about. Right. And then we'll ask people to bring those themes or values to life through their own stories that have actually happened to them or to their clients. But that the point is that they were there, they've seen these stories firsthand and they can tell us about them.
I have kind of a personal mantra about listening that sometimes I'd ask people, like, if we're engaged in conversation, and I mean, I have to ask it judiciously so it's not offensive, but there are times when I'll ask them, I'll say, are you listening to respond? Or are you listening to understand? Because the difference is, I'm just waiting for you to give me a break so I can tell you what I want to tell you, versus I'm really listening to understand your perspective and the things you're trying to share with me. But I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. So, kind of put your money where your mouth is on the podcast here. So if you and I are in an elevator, what's the hip pocket story that you're telling me to show me the value of the company Narativ?
Oh, that's great. I love it. Well, I would say, it's, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a short story about one of our clients, because I really do believe that if you want to say something about the value of what you do, rather than saying something that's kind of general about it, quote unquote, the elevator pitch, it's sometimes, again, it'll fall flat or it'll work, but you're never quite sure. So I like to tell stories about clients, and people who've actually done this. So I had this one client, a big company, financial company, and he was saying that, they have so much data to communicate about and to convey that he's not quite sure what to communicate about. I've got 20, 30 points of data that I got to get through this PowerPoint deck. And he showed me the PowerPoint deck. And after 5 slides, I was like, how many more of these do you have? He said 35. Oh my God.
Glassed over.
Exactly. So then we went to work and I asked him, what do you relate to in this? What's the most important piece of data in this? And then he told me a story about his father. This was about a retirement insurance product. And he told me about how his father had an accident on the job, and he had been able to put all 4 kids through college. And here he was at 50 years old in serious pain and had to go on disability, and a year and a half of rehab because he'd fallen off a 12-foot ladder in a warehouse and had nothing that he'd saved for retirement, even though he was getting regular paychecks. But his bank account at the end of that year was zero in terms of his savings for retirement. And that's the story he told eventually to that group that he was presenting to. His PowerPoint deck went down to 5 slides instead of 40. And you could hear a pin drop in the audience, and they were all leaning in to learn, how can we help people like your father? And what he said, my father's not alone. The average retirement account in America right now is $0.
Wow. And
he ended that way. And so that's my story to you, to show you the value, because without that story, everything kind of, it's, again, half of that, maybe a third of the room is in agreement, a third disagrees, and another third is indifferent. But when you have a real story of a real person, it changes everything.
I love the way you kind of framed it earlier. You said, it's, how do I personalize this? And this is out of personal experience, and this is drawing a direct application out of personal experience. And otherwise, I'm telling someone else's story, and there's a lack of genuineness or connection, in that story. And I think even astute listeners probably can pick that up. In the process, that you're just telling me this kind of vicariously, right? This is not this didn't happen to you. It happened to somebody you knew, right? or somebody you didn't know. You're just making a story up to make me kind of play on my sympathies with my thinking about my father being disabled, type thing. So it's an interesting, it's a really interesting genre, just the whole idea behind storytelling. But I think it's highly underutilized. Just in general. And not just in business, just in general. And I mean, how many cultures on the planet are still, more of a storytelling culture versus, written communication type thing?
Yeah, and this is what we started with. In the humanity started with those stories and those cave paintings. That we see where it's clearly, one person communicating to another about the dangers of this herd of mammoths, and or where to get food and that sort of thing. These were ways to communicate that are exactly like a story,
Mm-hmm.
and it preceded our ability to speak and to write. And so I think, you're right, how many of those kind of cultures are left. But what's interesting is that in my experience, when we tap into that, there's no one that doesn't respond to it, because it's just a natural thing. And it doesn't matter. We've, at this point, I think we've had to translate our work in maybe 10 or 15 languages, and across the world. It really does cross these cultural barriers, and everyone has a very positive response of understanding, right? Like you were saying earlier, because now when I'm telling you a story, you understand my circumstances differently than if you're just kind of waiting to speak yourself,
Right. Right.
as a listener, waiting to respond. The story kind of stops that, and it forces us to just engage, because we can't really help ourselves. We have to know what's going to happen next.
And I'm not looking to argue your story. I'm
Yeah.
not looking to try to one up,
Right.
I may try to one up you with the story, but then it's my story again. So,
Right, exactly. And that's the point too, is like, you're creating dialogue that way. I was just talking to someone who specializes in conflict resolution, and they look at different ways, and again, it has to do with listening. But they were saying that when someone tells a story, that first of all, that when two people or two groups are in really big disagreements. I mean, she actually worked with people in Northern Ireland, between the IRA and others, and so big disagreements, to say the least. And yet, what would happen is that you would have all these assumptions about the person that's walking through the door, based on what you've heard about them, or the label that you have in your head about them. And then when they tell a story, those assumptions start to crumble, because now you're hearing about them perhaps as a child, growing up somewhere, and what the kind of food that they ate, and what clothes they were, and what kinds of struggles they had. There's a different understanding that happens when you hear about someone's circumstances as they happened in their life, as opposed to their feelings and thoughts about their circumstances. But the actual things that happened, that's what speaks most to people, and that's what creates understanding. And then it makes you want to tell a story as well, and to say, oh, well, let me tell you about how I grew up, and where there's a connection, and where there's a disconnect, perhaps.
It's just a personal example. I mean, we were living in the Middle East when 9/11 happened, and the perception, ethnically, and when country to country, there was a real disparaging attitude, probably toward countries located in the Middle East. When you met individuals, that kind of melted away, because of the story, because of the the personalization, and the fact that they reached out, and they were kind, and they you lived next door, and just the whole idea that kind of broke down those barriers, exactly what you were talking about earlier. And it was an interesting time.
I'm imagining, my God. But that's what happens all the time, right? We tend to create these what we call these dominant narratives. And a lot of times those dominant narratives are extremely detrimental to a group of people. And that's what marginalizes people, is that you're not part of the dominant narrative, so you're outside of it. And so I don't pay attention to that, because I'm only interested in the dominant narrative. And when I even bring it back to the business world, it's no different. There's a dominant narrative about salespeople. You're going to sell something to me. You're going to sound like a robot. You're going to talk to me about all the features and how this has changed your life, and how maybe it will change mine, but you're probably not going to really listen to me, and you probably don't care about me, right? That's the dominant narrative about sales. And so what we're doing with these stories, and especially these personal stories, is we're breaking down these dominant narratives and those stereotypes, so much so that really you can't help but look at it with a new perspective, because now you're hearing about this real person that's in front of you, and they're laying something out for you where they're talking about something that, might be a little vulnerable and something that, was challenging to them in their own life. And it's hard to ignore that. Now you've got that picture in your mind. You can't sort of, forget that picture.
Yeah, storying is powerful. There is no doubt about it. There's a real power in the ability to tell a good story to, we talked about it for generations. Spinning a yarn, the whole idea of just kind of what does it mean to sit down and kind of captivate and capture someone's attention. But I'm interested to talk a little bit about the company itself. So, are we talking about two dudes sitting in a little tiny office somewhere in New York City? Are we talking about 100 people?
That's what it was at first. Yeah.
So what's been kind of the growth pattern of Narativ?
It was definitely me and Murray for a while. There's another founder who's more of a silent partner, Paul. So I would meet him from time to time. And it was really the two, sometimes three of us for a while until, we got those first clients. And then what we decided to do, we had sort of two choices. One is that once we started to get some tracking and momentum, in my head, as the CEO of this company, I was now thinking, all right, well, we can either go the route of, the big consulting agencies and get an army of trainers and train them up. And, that's who we send out into the world. Or we can actually create programs where within those companies, we've got these, what we call these ambassadors, right. And I'm talking about our clients now, where we actually do training the trainers programs within those companies. And many times, these are people who they're not necessarily the leaders of the company, but and they're not even necessarily directors. They're more like managers. And they're also people who see a lot of new hires and onboard new hires. And so I quickly found out that was probably the most effective way to do things. And it also allowed us to keep a fairly lean budget because, right now we've got 5 full-time employees. So we've always kept it pretty lean. And yet we've got all these trainers that are more part-time who we've trained and are part of our team, but they're not full-time. And so they go out and do this work. But most of the people who sort of have learned this methodology actually are in these companies that are our clients. So that's sort of the model that we went with. So we don't have a huge amount of people, but within these companies, we've got all these ambassadors, and that pays dividends later too when people move from one company to another or department to another because they remember us and they still have this knowledge, that they want to pass on to others.
Is it really like a one-off model type thing? We're going to teach you the system and then you develop the application later. You decide where you want to apply this, or is this like we have, here's a 101 level, here's our 201 level, 301, 401. We have kind of add-on services and stuff like that.
Yeah, we definitely, it's definitely with the, services that kind of build on the previous one. You can have it as a one-off, and certainly get a lot of value out of it and be able to get a lot of runway out of it too. But I think inevitably there's always new applications that happen and new people come on board. And, we always find out that, we need to come back in so that transfer of knowledge happens. And so what we've done is we've actually created some programs a little bit in the same logic that you were just, laying out in terms of it's the 201, the 301, et cetera. But for us, what we're now doing is at the level of onboarding, when new hires come in, we're now working much more with the broader culture of the company.
Right.
So what are the values of the company? What's the mission? And what are you telling your new hires as soon as they come in? What's that story you're telling? So we're now consulting with companies to help on that messaging for new hires.
For sure.
And then we're training those new hires so that they themselves will potentially be the ones who tell the new hires in 2 years what the story is, So there's this kind of cycle that's happening, and that's been great for us because, we essentially come once or twice a year with a new, with these new people who've gone through that process and who are now going to teach others.
Kind of the each one teach one,
Yes.
mentality. You teach what you learn. But so
Yeah.
I could see, you know, teaching them how to share the story of their company culture or whatever. But do you also help companies even develop their culture? Like,
Yeah.
like how do we codify it? That type of thing.
Yeah.
So
And the interesting thing about that is that I remember a real estate company that we worked with a long time ago. They were one of our first clients, and they had a very strong company culture actually, and it was almost like a family, and many people described it that way. But at first it was just a few people, maybe a dozen people, and then they grew to about 50, 60 people fairly quickly. In a year or two that happened. And so suddenly, this tight-knit family doesn't really feel that way
yeah.
anymore. And so what we did is that we brought in everyone at an offsite and a retreat type of event. And we spent a day with them, and we had the original group of people who were in the company. There were 10 or so people, and each person came up with a story that was related to one of the values, the original values that they had come up with, all those years ago. And then we asked the audience, which was predominantly, new people or fairly new, a year or two, and we asked them, what did you hear as the values of this company? Does that feel right to you, given these stories that you just heard? And it was fascinating because a lot of the core values were there, but then on a board, we had 10 or 15 other ones. And then we started doing this process with them of looking at, well, who are you really today? And it made the new people kind of feel this great sense of belonging, because they were like, oh, hey, look, that's my word up there. That's now on the company site. Wow. And that's in the office, and I've only been here for 6 months. And yet the person who's been there for, 5 years, they relate to it as well. And so it not only creates this kind of, esprit de corps and belonging, but it really also, evolves these, this culture of this company in a way that's a lot more authentic. It's kind of updated, and now this is truly who we are because we came up with it. It's not some creative agency that came up with it.
And it's their internal story. It's just kind of putting into words what they wanted to convey. But I can continue to ask you questions and draw stories out of you all day long, but I want to respect your time, and I do want to give you an opportunity to kind of share, as having led a company for a number of years, what are really one or two like key takeaways that you would say, man, I wish I would have known these two really salient points of 10 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever you pick the time frame, but I think would really have been a game changer and saved me a lot of pain, saved our company some heartache, in the process.
Yeah.
People that are a little further behind you in the journey right now, what are one or two things that kind of stand out?
I mean, this is hard for anybody who's an entrepreneur, I think. And I think we all kind of struggle with this, but, patience is definitely something that I have valued over the years, because I think there is an impatience, especially at the beginning of things, where you see the value of what you're doing. And, you get a couple people who don't. And so you go from one person pitching it to another, and, it's like hitting a brick wall. And so there's value in that experience because it forces you to be more and more specific and, figure out what are the challenges, why aren't they listening to you, and what is that wall that you're hitting. So that's valuable. But I think there's also something about, I know that, being impatient or having, there's a couple of times where, well, maybe this just shouldn't do this. There's no, why continue, right? And then it's usually in those moments that something happens where, suddenly that client, kind of falls into your lap, or something positive happens, and that keeps you going, right? But I do think that if I had known, kind of this long game mentality, I think is really helpful. And that's not always, especially, as a younger person at the time, I definitely wanted things to happen faster. And I think if I'd been able to let go of that, maybe it wouldn't have been such a it wouldn't have been good, the cause of kind of more personal suffering.
Right. Right.
Because, for an outsider, you'd be like, oh yeah, well, of course things don't happen from one day to the next, but it is sort of what society, I think, I mean, not to get too philosophical about this, but, I do think that there is something about our society that's sort of about immediate gain and, quick gratification and that sort of thing.
Microwave mentality.
Yeah, when the reality is that things take time, and
Mhm.
once you get that, and I certainly get it now, it allows you to kind of relax a little bit
Yeah.
and see the longer runway, which is always helpful anyway, to have that sort of vision, because that impatience really gets in the way of your vision.
And it's such a broad ranging, kind of tidbit. It's a broad ranging nugget, and
Yeah.
it would apply in so many different areas. But
Right.
Jerome, I really appreciate you just taking time today, just kind of share the story of not only of Narativ, but also of Jerome DeRoy, and just kind of walking us through, and then the importance of being, of storying well, of telling a good story, and of the applications that you can draw out of that. But I just really appreciate you just joining us and really playing your part in helping all boats rise in a rising tide. Jerome, have a great weekend. Bon weekend. Bon weekend,
Merci
mon ami.
beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. It's a pleasure.
Another episode in the books. We hope you heard some great takeaways. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a 5-star review on iTunes and YouTube. As always, thanks for listening to Rising Tide.